following the publication of the Summa Theologica by Aquinas, which had in turn, as it has its ripple effect across society, produces the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific industrial revolution, nationalism, capitalism, all these things that are flowing out of this radicalization of the Aristotelian logic, which is fundamentally the principle of the law of non-contradiction, which is reducible to a single word, which is the word or, this or that. Whereas in yin yang thought, it's always this and that. And in fact, you can go back to the Shang Dynasty and you can find this word and, which is the primary philosophical value, social value that's really guiding the way they're thinking. In China, the key value was always the unity of opposites. So the unity of opposites versus the law of non-contradiction.
Today's episode is made possible by Days to Expiry, a tool that I co-created with Florian and Lovis to help navigate the complex world of options trading. As someone who has extensively used options to enhance their long-term investments, I can attest to the importance of getting the right signals from a sea of trading noise. Achieving financial freedom is a crucial step towards personal freedom, a topic that many of our guests have already spoken about at length. To learn more about how I am working towards my own financial goals, visit daystoexpiry.com.
Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney, welcome to the show. Just for our audience, let me introduce Professor Mahoney. He is a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai. He serves as director of the International Graduate Program in Politics and executive director of the International Center for Advanced Political Studies. He spent years studying governance, political systems, development models, and the evolution of China's political economy, not from a distance, but from inside China's academic environment. Jason and I are very excited today about this conversation because it's different from what we normally do. We usually speak with investor types or entrepreneurs, and more generally speaking, people who see that we see as unencumbered in walking their own path in life. And we like to hear about and analyze our guests' view of the world, their philosophies, how their thinking shapes what they do, etc. And this often leads to an analysis of incentives, feedback loops, stability, performance, and failure modes. And what we've noticed is that when it comes to China, there's something fascinating happening. Even highly intelligent people that we admire a lot often operate with radically different mental models of what China actually is. And then terms like Marxism, Leninism, state capitalism, authoritarianism, and the infamous social credit score get thrown around, often blended together, and very few people ever really slow down to examine the underlying architecture. So today, we're not really here to promote or defend any system, Eastern or Western. We're here to understand it better. We want to strip away the labels, dodge the propaganda on all sides, and compare operating systems the way we think serious adults should. And by examining what each system optimizes for, and how they correct for errors, how they build incentives, and where they may be vulnerable. Professor Mahoney, thank you so much for taking the time to help us sharpen our own understanding today.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks to both of you, Lovis and Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. And, I'm going to try to live up to what you're looking for. Although, unfortunately, when we do talk about China, it's inevitable that we end up using certain catchphrases that I think are sometimes self-defeating, certain terms. So it'll be impossible to avoid these altogether. But I think we can start talking about things in a more realistic and practical way, so that your audience might have a better understanding. Although it may get a little academic at times, I'm much more interested in the practical side of it.
Well, that's great, because I think Lovis and I are also always trying to tease through all the theoretical terminologies and, the headlines we read to get down to the real crux of the matter and see how things actually get done. So practical is good. So, Professor, I actually don't know how many years you've already spent living and working in China. Could you share that with us before we go further?
Sure. I So I had earned a master's of science in public health in epidemiology, and then an MPA public administration, and had gone to work as a public health officer with the CDC in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, in the 1990s, and was working on a lot of what we call Superfund sites, environmental disaster areas in the United States, industrial environmental disaster areas. And then got promoted up to a higher level position in Washington, and became increasingly from both the working at the state level with state governments, and then working already at the national level in Atlanta, and then going to an even higher level, where you're sitting in on meetings with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and seeing how decisions are being made, how data is being used or abused. I became very disillusioned, and decided that I wanted to transition to academics. And so what I did was I started looking for programs, but I had also wanted to spend more time abroad. My initial interest in public health had been in international health. My undergraduate studies had been in Latin American studies in economics, and had spent some time overseas. Um, and so it just so happened that I had a friend who was a vice mayor of Shenyang up in northeast China, who offered me a position as a consultant on a sustainable development project that was being funded by the EU, related to environmental health. And so I decided to take a year as sort of a gap year between government service and going back to a PhD. So in 1998, I came to Shenyang, which at that time was the second most polluted city in the world after Mexico City, and lived there for a year. And at that time, Shenyang was in very difficult conditions. Not only was the pollution really bad, but um, it had been one of the cities that had I think really borne the brunt, the early brunt of reform and opening up, because this is the Northeast where a lot of the industrial, Rust Belt economy existed, and you had all of these old factories that were at the end of their life cycle, and what you had were new investments being made in Guangdong down in southern China, um, and so you had a collapsing economy in the Northeast. Um, which also led to a tremendous amount of corruption and organized crime. But so, despite being in that city at that time, which was um, really, I think the unofficial but real unemployment rate at that time was 40%. People were burning tires in order to stay warm. You had already the high sulfur coal. You would have a heavy snow. I think it was 20 below, 30 below Celsius during the worst days. And within an hour of snowfall, the snow on the ground would be black from the particulate falling out of the sky. So it was sort of a very difficult, I think, environment uh, in every sense of the word to live in. And yet, I was very impressed by my experience there. Having worked in government in the U.S., having seen sort of the struggle to make effective policy, and to see that policy being subverted by political and business interest. Um, I, uh, I came away with an idea that the Chinese had figured something out, even if they didn't know what it was themselves, that they knew something that we didn't know in the U.S. And so that was sort of haunting me as I began my doctoral studies, and then I came back to that um, topic, and started looking at the political system and trying to understand the political system and how it worked and how it evolved. At that time, Jiang Zemin was the center of the party. So in 98, for a year, I lived in Shenyang. In 99, 2000, I came back on directed research and lived in Guangdong. So sort of the opposite, right? The opposite side of things. in Malming, which is one of the major oil towns. Sinopec has a lot of their operations based there. Um, so lived in Malming for a bit doing research, and then came back to the United States, and um, and then spent 10 years as a professor, and increasingly as a political activist in the U.S. And then in 2009, late 2009, I was because of my political activities, I was bought out and blacklisted, um, and then left the U.S. and went to work for the top think tank of the Central Committee in Beijing, doing sort of two different roles. One, I was a technical advisor on the for the team that was translating Jiang Zemin's selected works, because I'd focused so much on his ideas in my dissertation, and I had developed an expertise in Marxism. So I could, one of the problems with translators, even Chinese translators at that level, they may know English really, really well, but they don't necessarily know Marxism in English very well. And sometimes you can use the wrong terms in English to describe certain concepts. So I was there to sort of reconcile that. But on the other side, they had a research unit that I was supporting as a research fellow. I didn't like Beijing as a place to live. I was raising two young children. I decided to continue my relationship with Beijing, but by moving to Shanghai. So that was late 2010. That's when I came to East China Normal University, which has been home to me ever since. And it's a great place to raise a family and to make a living. Um, but all told, it's been about 20 years. But the bulk of it, the last 16 years in Shanghai, and then little bits and pieces in Beijing, Maoming, Xi'an, Shanxi, a lot of research in Hainan. Um, so around about 20 years, yeah. But since '98.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. I actually just went to Shenyang in Liao. It's in Liaoning, right? I just went
That's right.
there a year ago for work, to visit a customer, a solar manufacturer, and I didn't know that it was that bad just a few short decades ago, right? Like you wouldn't be able to tell that when you're there today.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, So you alluded to something just now where you said that when you first came to China, you noticed that maybe the Chinese, what was the word you used, that they had something special, like in the way that they were governing. Was that right? Um,
Yeah, I was a little vague, and I apologize for that. But it's something like that I could sense. I had an intuitive sense that the Chinese, despite all the challenges that I observed, I should back up and say that I had done my first master's research in a cholera hospital in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I had, as I said, I had done economics related to Latin America, and so I had spent a lot of time moving through Latin America and observing how and why things were not working in Latin America and all the various development strategies that they had employed and seen falter. Seen extreme poverty in Yucatan, Guatemala. This is back in the early 90s, 91, 92. And then in '94, I'm in Bangladesh, which has changed a lot since then. But it was one of the poorest places in the world. And I'm working in a cholera hospital and literally holding babies while they die every day. Um, and then I'd spent time in India, and so I had a sense of poverty in the United States, having grown up in rural Alabama, but also the work that I was doing in these areas that had manufacturing collapses. These old a lot of the old chemical plants along the Ohio River Valley, which were wholly owned subsidiaries, and whenever they would reach the end of their life cycle, they would just be sort of crashed, and the whole local economy would crash. You have all these local people who were not able to, who were suffering from cancer, and they didn't have jobs now, and they weren't able to sell their homes, and it was my job to go and explain to them why we couldn't save them from these circumstances. So I had a sense of poverty, and I had a sense of the limits of governance and the ability to solve problems based on my experiences overseas and also in the United States. And then I come to Shenyang, and I see a city in crisis. And in fact, later the mayor, I believe the mayor and the party secretary of the city would be executed for extreme corruption. It had become something of the center of organized crime and sort of a case study for the Chinese government about how not to advance reforms to avoid sort of that type of social breakdown. But I'm saying even in the midst of observing all of that, I still had a sense that there was a very different approach to development, to solving problems, and I wanted to figure out what that was. And I had become increasingly disillusioned with what I was seeing in terms of the ideological values or the sort of structural mechanisms in the U.S. itself, and I had an open mind about what might be other alternatives or ways of sort of solving basic human needs and ensuring that people were able to move forward in a meaningful way. So that's the sense that I got, despite the catastrophe in Shenyang, and then I wanted to figure out what that was, and this led me to again sort of starting with what was the ruling ideology, and this is I'll be a little esoteric, but about that time is when Jiang Zemin had introduced something in Chinese we call the Sangadaidiao, the three represents. So I ended up focusing a big part of my dissertation on trying to understand what are the three represents, how did Deng Xiaoping theory evolve from Mao Zedong thought, how did that evolve from Marxism in various ways. Someone who grew up as a Christian, as a white male, heterosexual Christian in rural Alabama, and who voted Republican in his first the first time he had an opportunity to vote. So this sort of free market liberal ideology was really the religion of my household. So, but I had become convinced that was disingenuous or wasn't working for some reason. And I'll give you sort of a strange point. When I was a young boy, again in Haleyville, Alabama, I read a lot, and I remember coming across. I would just read whatever I could find in the school library that was interesting, and I read like a pocket biography of John Paul Jones, not the basis of Led Zeppelin, but the old naval hero of the Revolutionary War, and I remember being very impressed by him, and it left a strong memory. And then when I was living in Washington, working in Washington in the mid '90s, I was walking down near the National Mall and noticed a statue that I'd never seen before. It's sort of off on a strange little island off to the side of the mall in a way of John Paul Jones, and then it sort of rekindled my childhood interest, and I started looking and this is before you could go to the internet and read whatever you wanted. So I started looking for a more mature biography and found one. The person I was dating at the time was working for the governor in Maryland, in Annapolis, and she found a copy of the best biography of John Paul Jones at the Naval Academy bookstore, because he's a hero of the Naval Academy. And I read that novel, excuse me, that biography very carefully. And what really sort of captivated me was that he was the only really functional naval captain during the Revolutionary War. All the others, it was all nepotism. They were all, these guys who were the nephews or uncles of members of the Continental Congress, and they would sit on these ships in the harbor. They would never go out and challenge the British ships, and they were just living off the corruption. And so it was interesting. And John Paul Jones, had gone out and he scored all these significant naval victories, not significant necessarily in turning the tide of the war, but certainly hugely important in morale building. But he was the only one who was really competent. And he would then later go on, he became disillusioned with the US and went on to work in Europe and ultimately Catherine the Great. And it was interesting because this was a guy who was a hero to me. And as I was observing sort of extreme corruption at that time in Washington, I realized that this problem had always been there from the beginning, and that there had always been these incredible drags on the ability for people to actually do things that serve society in a way that I felt were necessary. And it was interesting because Jones was vilified. He was supposedly a hero of democracy, but then he went to work for Catherine the Great, this terrible autocrat, and that was sort of the framing of what he had done. But then, if you go back and you look at other major American heroes, and I know this is taking us off course, and I'm not sort of patting myself on the back, but a great number of American heroes ended up abandoning the U.S. Davy Crockett, the Austins. You're in Texas now. A lot of people left. Daniel Boone, and because they were disillusioned with what they saw as the way the institutional frameworks were not actually moving towards the goals that they had valorized, but were manifesting in darker ways. So that's sort of a darker conversation, but nevertheless, that's sort of what was going through my mind. And so I was in this moment of disillusion, but it was a moment that was that I felt had a deep historical basis, and so that sort of like created the opening, I think, intellectually and emotionally, to consider alternatives. I can give you an example. I was working for this agency in DC that part of the Health and Human Services Department, and it was responsible for advising health policy. And we had an incredible amount of data, for example, that the vast majority of the back surgeries in the United States were not only unnecessary and incredibly costly, they were crippling people. And so we put out a paper demonstrating this. And it just so happened that the person, one of the leading members of the Senate at that time, was a surgeon from my home, what later became my home state of Tennessee. And he orchestrated the zeroing out of our budget unless we withdrew that paper. And so we withdrew that paper, and back surgeries continued to be funded by Medicare and Medicaid. Literally, people paying taxes to carve up their fellow citizens in ways that were enriching doctors. And that was one sort of dramatic example. There were others that it was very difficult for me to accept being part of that. And so it wasn't purely an ideological or a theoretical concern, but it was something that I had observed not only in poor communities where people were suffering and dying from cancer from the exposures that they had to environmental contamination, but it was also something that was happening on a much larger scale. And so this was the disillusion that opened the door to me considering alternatives. And again, when I first arrived in China in '98, I expected it to be something like India. These are two countries that more or less China, the PRC is established in '49. India is established as an independent nation in 48. And I expected a similar level of development, or I should say, maybe not necessarily a similar level of development, but a similar level of backwardness. And I didn't find that here. I found that the Chinese development level was far past what I had observed in India. Um, and so this created for me this idea that there was a trajectory of development that was moving in a certain way, and that I wanted to, and that it would eventually, you know, reach a much higher level. This is what I could do. So then I wanted to understand what were the nuts and bolts of that.
Well, well, Professor, thank you so much for sharing so much of the background. So, I mean, you've spent substantial time all over the world, essentially interacting with the poorest of the poor in really, really adverse conditions. So, what I take away from that is that you're a pretty compassionate person, because ultimately what brought you there is that you wanted to figure out how to help, right? And I think that's really important for people to understand when they um, listen to this. And it's something I didn't know ahead of time, right? But so I'm trying to get a little bit more into the, let's say, the technical part of a conversation. So one thing that I struggle with personally, and I hope that you can help clarify some, is in the West, when we talk about Marxism, Leninism, Soviet-style central planning, and then now we have modern China, it often gets kind of all blended together. And I would be really curious to know from your vantage point from inside China, which elements of like classical Marxism are actually operational today, and which survive mostly just in language, or just how would you dissect that?
Well, I think
Professor, could I just add a little bit to Lovis's question? Because I
sure.
have similar, um, I'm curious about the same topic, but my wife's family is from East Germany, the former East Germany, right? So maybe also help me understand what's different about Marxism when it's in China or when it's being studied and applied in China versus when it was done in Europe back a few decades ago, because it seems like it's the same word, but the results and the things we see as outputs, it's just so different. So is that to do with culture or what is it?
So I'm going to give you. I'm going to try to avoid a long-winded response and get straight to the point. There is a fundamental difference between what we would call Chinese Marxism and what we would call Soviet Marxism, or what we would call Western Marxism. These are three very different things. Okay. Classical Marxism would be another thing, right? So classical Marxism is generally what we ascribe directly to Marx, and some would argue that Engels is part of that, or he's already sort of like revising things in some important ways. But it's unnecessarily academic for our purposes. Um, what you have are major innovations or deviations, depending on your perspective, with Lenin and the development of the Soviet Union and what becomes Leninism and onward, or Marxism-Leninism. And of course, there are major deviations from Lenin in terms of what Stalin is doing, especially in the late 1920s. Uh, Stalin, for example, embraces state capitalism. He embraces the idea that had been very taboo to Lenin of socialism in one country. And so those are things that are happening in the Soviet sphere. In the West, you had Marxist in the West being, not the Soviet Union, west of the Soviet Union, and before World War II and the Warsaw Pact countries. But what you had were Western Marxists trying to understand why Marxism had not succeeded in the West, in the most developed capitalist economies, because that's where Marx had predicted it would take place. and why had it succeeded in the Soviet Union, at least succeeded in some sense of the word, following the October Revolution. And so this is where you have some some very important theoretical divergences, um, and these theoretical divergences are moving in two broad directions from the West to the Soviet side. One, the Soviet side is, oh my God, we won power, but Lenin predicted that when we won power, it would be the iskra, the spark that would launch the world revolution, and then we would all be struggling together to realize socialism. And it turns out that doesn't work, and it turns out that we're going to have to make some market reforms and embrace state capitalism, and then we're going to have to accelerate these developments because we're alone in the world, and we have a rising risk in Germany, which is going to require other types of political and economic discipline. So, they're going to go pretty far down the road of Stalin or Stalinism. Whereas in the West, you have the failed revolutions of Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. You have the failure of Gramsci in Italy. You have the failure of Lukács, who ends up coming into the Soviet sphere. You have all of these failures in the West. And as a result, what we see is that Marxism in the West never really is able to propel a party into power and have to start facing the real responsibilities of governance, and which in other words, they're able to stay almost entirely in the realm of theory. And so you have in the Soviet experience something that is super practical, responding to the crises, including crises of their own making, whereas Marxist theory in the West tends to be hyper theoretical and idealized, and very critical, but never really having the opportunity to rule or having to make very, very difficult decisions. Although you will have parties like the PCF in France that will be ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union. To a large extent, this is sort of political opportunism or free riding. Now, in China, what is strikingly different is initially in we start to see the arrival of Marxist concepts in China sometime around 1905. We don't have a precise date. Oh, this is the day it came in, but we know, after China was defeated by Japan in 1895, you had an increasing number of Chinese who were going to Japan because they wanted to figure out what Japan had figured out, right? Um, and as they got into Japan, they started encountering a lot of Western ideas, and some of the ideas they encountered included Marxist concepts. And because the Japanese would translate these concepts into kanji, and because kanji was had originated in the Chinese characters, a lot of these concepts start getting um, um, brought into China through the Japanese kanji. Um, and this was sort of the first introduction of some of the Marxist ideas. And then you have the crisis in, you have the growing crisis of the failure of the Kuomintang after the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. You have the growing failure of the new Republic of China to actually solve problems, right? And partly this is due to the corruption of Yuan Shikai and the abdication of power by Sun Zhongshan or Sun Yat-sen, and so it's a mess, and you're still dealing with warlords and peasants and revolutions and hunger, and then you have the failures associated with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So China had supported the Europeans with the understanding that if Germany was defeated, then the German concession of Shandong would revert to Chinese control. But the Treaty of Versailles instead gave Shandong to Japan, which was a huge betrayal. and another great existential risk to China. And this sparks the May 4th movement, and it sets in motion a huge number of things. And it creates a milieu. So already before the May 4th, you had a large number of people who were trying to figure out, because they already understood that they had the problems associated with the failed governance of the new Republic of China. And so, and you had, the new culture movement and all these things taking place. But then you have the critical failure associated with the Treaty of Versailles. And then we have what is sometimes described as a new 100 schools period, let 100 schools of thought contend, let 100 flowers bloom. And in the midst of that, you have all these study groups around China, some, like Husserl, who's studied with Dewey, who is trying to develop pragmatism as an ideology that could serve the Chinese state. But you also have a Marxist study group at Peking University Library, which at that time the director of the library was a guy by the name of Li Dajiao, and he had an assistant named Mao Zedong. And this is where we really see the starting point of Chinese Marxism. And there are some unresolved questions, but there are nevertheless conclusions. So what's interesting about Mao and Li is that they were both peasants. They had become educated, but they were considered peasant stock. And one of the taboos in classical Marxism, and certainly Soviet Marxism, is that peasants can't play a role in the vanguard. They can't be part. They haven't developed sort of the critical consciousness through the socialization of labor. They haven't they haven't learned. They haven't developed the sufficient class consciousness to now stand toe to toe with as the proletariat against the bourgeoisie or the capitalists. But what's interesting is that Li and Mao, when they are reading Marxism, at least the text that they have access to, they are discerning the Marxist dialectic. But the way that they're understanding that dialectic is through the Chinese native thought patterns, which are based on yin-yang thought. If you go all the way back to the Shang dynasty, you can see it's in the middle period of the Shang dynasty, several thousand years ago, when they first start writing characters. You can already see in the way that they're writing characters, the way that they're conceptualizing characters, that yin-yang thought is already part of their logic, and that this in turn will produce things like what we in the West we call the I Ching, or what in Chinese is called the I Ching. It will also produce Taoism, Confucianism, Mohism, legalism. Later, when Buddhism comes to China, it will only succeed when it's sort of dialecticized by being interpreted through the Lotus Sutra being reinterpreted through Taoism. So this all, and then you have Marxism that comes in, but every major system of thought going back to ancient times that has emerged in China, or those that have come into China and then taken root, they have been dialecticized, or what we might say sinicized in the proper Chinese term, meaning that this value of yin-yang, of the yin-yang worldview, is somehow or another used as the primary interpretive frame. And this is what Mao and Li are doing in their early days. Now, let's just set that up as one little point, and then realize that during, while Li and Mao were doing this Marxist study group at Peking University, you had another group of Chinese people like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, who had gone to France and had become radicalized. They had gone to France. They were working in these factories. French factories have a long history of radicalism, and they go there and they become radicalized. And then you had another group of Chinese who had gone directly to the Soviet Union. And they are learning, they're being completely indoctrinated in the Soviet understanding of Marxism. This other group that goes to France, many of them will go onward to the Soviet Union, some of them will come back. But in the early days of the party, you have three main groups. You have this group that's centered around Mao, that's inspired initially by the association with Lee. You have this group that was, we call the Chinese Bolsheviks, that had gone to the Soviet side, and then you have these others who are leaning in the Soviet Union's direction, but they're not completely indoctrinated. They were highly talented people. That's why they got to go to France, and then they went onward to the Soviet Union. So they have a different sort of intelligence and criticality, and they're going to be decisive in some of the later developments. So you have the formation of the party in 1921 in Shanghai. The Internationale sends representatives, and Mao is part of that, but he's a marginal figure. And the early part of the party is very much the Soviet model. Interestingly, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, had under after May 4th, under Sun Yat-sen's leadership, had gone to the Soviet Union and itself been reorganized as a Leninist party. And the idea there, the Soviet Union agreed to do that in order, with the stipulation that the Chinese communists would be allowed to be a junior partner in the Kuomintang government, which was accomplished. Sun Yat-sen dies of cancer. Chiang Kai-shek, or Chiang Kai-shek, takes power. He moves the party to the right. 27, 28, we have the crisis, and in the meantime, you had a Mao line that was developing in the party that was distinct from the Soviet line, and it was distinct. It was distinct because what's interesting about Lee and Mao, as I said, is that they were peasants, and they already are writing themselves into the revolution. But if it were strictly a Soviet or classical Marxist revolution, they have no place in it. You understand? So, but at the same time, they're thinking through yin yang, and the difference, the key to understanding yin yang thought is a single word, and this is the word "and." All right, so it's this and that, and the reason why this is so important is because in Marxism, what we have is a dialectic. And in the dialectic, you have a thesis, to go through the old rubric, you have a thesis and an antithesis. And they come into a contradiction, they come into a conflict with each other. Now, in this, the origins of this sort of concept, some, Hegel would say you can go back to Heraclitus, you can go back to Parmenides, you can, find older versions of it. But in Hegel, this was supposed to be a corrective to Aristotelian logic, which had become radicalized in Europe following the publication of the Summa Theologica by Aquinas, which had in turn, as it has its ripple effect across society, produces the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific industrial revolutions, nationalism, capitalism, all these things that are flowing out of this radicalization of the Aristotelian logic, which is fundamentally the principle of the law of non-contradiction, which is reducible to a single word, which is the word or, this or that. Whereas in yin-yang thought, it's always this and that. And in fact, you can go back to the Shang Dynasty and you can find this word and, which is the primary philosophical value, social value that's really guiding the way they're thinking. So in China, the key value was always the unity of opposites. So the unity of opposites versus the law of non-contradiction. Now Hegel, responding to Kant, tries to create a corrective to this radicalization of Aristotle, and he creates the dialectic. But when he does so, he's still doing it within a Western frame, and he's not abandoning what we call the analytical tradition. So so the problem is that even in Western Marxism and Soviet Marxism, the dialectic is supposed to be a corrective to the radicalization of or, but within it, the or is still the central feature. So it's the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, right? And then they come into a conflict, and it's a zero-sum game. Okay. Whereas in China, when Li and Mao are writing themselves into the revolution, they're already the peasant. They're already the person who's not supposed to be in it. And they are conceptualizing things like the peasant worker alliance. And then later you will see, okay, we have to form the united front. Okay, it's a this and that. So we will form a united front with the Kuomintang. And then later, despite the Kuomintang trying to kill everyone, when the Communist Party has the opportunity to kill um, Chiang Kai-shek during the Xi'an incident in 1936, they again move in the direction of this. And it was, we're not going to kill him. We're going to force him to recreate the Second United Front, or to create the Second United Front. And then in 1937, Mao writes On Contradiction and on Practice, Mao Zedong and Shi Jianlun, where he's describing um, um, how we think and how we practice by virtue of how we think. And he doesn't seem to realize that what he is saying is really quite distinct from the Soviet understanding of dialectics. Um, but he is very much articulating sort of this yin-yang understanding of dialectics. And then interestingly, in 1938, Stalin responds with a book called Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which um, is really provoked by Mao's works, and saying, no, it is this or that. And he's citing Lenin and Engels and Marx. So if you really want to understand the fundamental difference of sort of Chinese Marxism, it begins with um, just two words: the difference between and versus or. And you can understand how this is important in bringing together contradictions like peasants and workers, creating united fronts, um, one country, two systems under Deng Xiaoping, um, socialist market economy, all these concepts of how, for example, a year and a half ago with the third plenum, how um, market, how the private sector needs to work in tandem with the public sector. Those we've been waiting for many years. One of the initial ideas once Xi Jinping had consolidated the party rectification that was 15 years overdue, is that we would see major reforms addressing issues related to state-owned enterprises, which had become bloated in part due to the corruption that had accelerated during the Jiang Zemin years, and that the Hu Jintao years were they were unable to rein it in because they were never able to push the Jiang faction out. And then you had the crisis of 2008, and you had the way the government ended up using state-owned enterprises as a way to push money into the economy, so then they became even more bloated. And it was one of the ways in which they survived that crisis. And then the idea is, okay, once Xi comes into power, once he's able to knock down the factional divides that had grown up and had gridlocked the ability to make progress, that we would then address the problems associated with state-owned enterprises. And we don't, for two reasons. First, because you have Trump, who's going to launch a trade war that's going to create all these frictions, and then you have COVID, and you end up having these massive structures that are going to end up providing not only stability for China in a time of crisis, but also producing a lot of the things that the rest of the world needed. So after we come out of COVID and we're in the post-COVID recovery, we come back to the question of, all right, what are we supposed to do with state-owned enterprises, and what's their relationship with the private sector? And it was it was really sort of a big question. To what extent was ideology or practicality going to guide this answer? And ultimately, it was decided that state-owned enterprises play a decisive, constructive role in supporting and maintaining society, especially in times of crises and transition. But at the same time, it's clear that the private sector is more nimble and better able at advancing technological innovation, which is a critical component of development. And so we need to find the right policy mix so that these two sides can support each other instead of imagining them as in an internal conflict. So again, this is the logic of and how we're going to sort of solve this problem as we move forward in a constructive way that serves society.
Yeah, Professor. So for those in the audience, right, that are probably not as versed with the Chinese way of doing things and the Chinese way of life, and all they get is what they see through media. And you being from Alabama, moving to China in your adulthood, maybe you can help to uh, translate maybe for the people back home or in the West more broadly. What's the main thing that people in the West misunderstand about China even today, right? With all the communication options we have and streaming, and like us now talking across 3 different locations, right? How is it that there's still this big gap in understanding? And could you maybe let us know what you think are the biggest gaps?
Well, it's a big question, unfortunately, and I know we want nice, succinct answers. I think I think there are a number of problems that sort of increase misunderstanding, and we can make a laundry list. But I think let's start with the darker elements, which include there is a fair amount of racism um, when it comes to people trying to understand. There is, unfortunately, I think still um, a we might describe Europe or the United States as being multicultural, but um, you know I think we all understand that racial problems um, remain a significant concern within the U.S. and European countries. There is systemic racism within those countries, but there's also systemic racism in the way the global system works. Um, so I think part of it is there is still a privileging of a ethnocentric or U.S. centric or white American centric worldview that finds it very difficult to imagine that people of a different race, of a different culture, may have figured something out that isn't simply good for them, but may be good for others as well. The second issue is, and I've already alluded to it, that people become very much committed to the structures that they have, in part because these have been um, uh, to use the old word, they've been interpolated ideologically to normalize these structures throughout their life. Um, but at the same time, they really don't have alternatives. So it's not like we can talk about building a Chinese model or Chinese system in the United States um, because that the way in which the Chinese system works is so unique to China. While people can certainly learn from it, there's no way that you can conceptualize building a party apparatus all the way down to the neighborhood. I'm in a neighborhood in Shanghai, and the party office is 100 meters from here from my neighborhood. Um, and then we have blah blah blah, district, sub-district, city, all the way up and all the way down to the village level, all the way up to Beijing. So it's really so you have a party apparatus and a state apparatus. There's no way that I think that. So one of the things that people misunderstand about China to illustrate this point is um, China isn't trying to export its model. China isn't trying to become the Soviet Union and rule the world. The Chinese are not even fully satisfied with how they rule themselves. They realize that their model is not exportable, whereas the U.S. is always trying to export its model to other countries, and we consistently seeing that model failing in other countries, but we also see it failing in the United States. So there's not there's more of a sense of I wouldn't say cultural exceptionalism, but there's I think a clear understanding that the way the system works here is how it works here, and it doesn't work if it tries to be if you try to transfer it, or the Chinese system also doesn't work if it tries to rule others, right? So China is always sort of trying to avoid being too directly responsible for the rule or development of other countries. It might work with, it might partner with, but it doesn't form military alliances. It tries to avoid taking too much responsibility because they know that that would ultimately be a risk to their own system, and they're not even fully satisfied with their own development level or governance capacities here. Um, Another thing is that you often see in the West is the idea that the party is a monolith that revolves around one man. That requires, a remarkable leap of faith, I think. Um, it may well be that the party itself wants to project that type of image, but in fact, the party, has roughly 100 million members across the entire country. The vast majority are farmers. You have tremendously different economic interests. For example, you have a coal economy in Shanxi. You have a green economy in Zhejiang. Um, and how do you resolve those differences at the level of policy? How do you resolve differences, say, between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is more interested in diplomatic solutions, versus the Ministry of, of Defense, which has to be ready to go to war? There are tremendous divergences that have to be. So how do you reconcile within the party itself a huge number of tremendously divergent and competing positions, which there has to be some sort of mechanism that resolves this in a way that you know keeps the military fully engaged, but keeps diplomacy fully engaged, keeps the country moving forward with green development, but doesn't reduce Shanxi coal miners to absolute poverty. How do you balance all of those competing interests? That's what the party does. And again, this is the logic of and. How do we bring together differences and mediate between those differences in order to ensure that we include the largest number of people in development, um, because that's what's necessary for governance and sustaining our self-empower and political legitimacy. So these are, so in this sense, President Xi certainly plays a pivotal role. He's more than just a figurehead. He has to be an extremely adept politician to hold those competing forces together and sometimes at bay. Uh, but the party is bigger than the man, and but at the same time, the party is um, a lot more diverse. So there's a system to bringing it all together. Another point that I would raise, and it's something that I have to write more about, is the party was created as the party as it became. I'm saying the party that Mao really begins to recreate in 1934 after the failures of the Soviet led the Soviet internationalists and the Chinese Bolsheviks had led the party to the brink of ruin after the encirclement eradication campaign. And then in 34 at the Junyi conference, Zhou Enlai leads the sort of the French faction against the Chinese Bolsheviks, throws his lot behind Mao Zedong, and then the party moves Mao's direction, and Mao begins to articulate the new party line in Yan'an. So the key point is that the party itself, so the country was in a crisis, and in after the May 4th movement, and in that period, because of the success of the October Revolution, the Chinese begin to consider Marxism as a possible solution to their crisis, and um, and then the party, following the Soviet line, encounters a crisis, and then in order to survive that crisis, they end up moving in the direction of the Mao line. And so, what's interesting about the party is that the party has always been Marxism and the party have always been a reaction to crises affecting the nation. And it's initially formed as a crisis facing the nation, but then it has to reform itself. It has to learn how to save itself from its own existential crisis before it can really begin to save the nation. So the party was always uh, created not just from this idea of the and versus the or, but also um, it's a party that is born of crisis. And to be honest with you, it functions best when it's faced with a crisis. It's always trying to say, okay, what is the big development goal? What's the big challenge? And when it doesn't understand that, when it doesn't understand what they call the principal contradiction, um, they can become a little misguided and inefficient. But once they realize, okay, this is what we're focused on, that's when the party system really works. It's like I don't know if any of you have ever owned an old Alfa Romeo. You're probably too young, but you know these like 1970s spiders. They tend you just roll you drive around the city and they start to drive really rough. But if you want to like tune them up, you don't have to take them to the shop. You take them up out on the highway. You run them up to about 100 miles an hour or 120 miles an hour, and it like shakes the motor. It shakes all the pieces back into the places where they belong, and then it runs perfect for another couple of weeks for daily driving. The party's sort of like a 1970s Alpha. It really realizes its efficiencies and its full potential to run when it's faced with a unifying crisis. Now, this is true of a lot of political systems, but it's also true that a lot of political systems that when they encounter a crisis, they actually begin to falter and fall in upon themselves. And above all, when the crisis is systemic, which I think is the case in the United States. So I think the misconception is, so for example, in the current White House, if we bring China a crisis, or even in the previous White House with Biden, so if we bring them a crisis related to chips, okay, that's going to break them. Or if we bring them a crisis related to trade, oh, that's going to break them. Or um, periodically you have these collapse theorists who look at China and go, oh, they've got all these problems, and so they're going to collapse it. No, no, it's when those problems reach an apex, that's when the party mobilizes and then realizes sort of this deep intrinsic ability to resolve crises. So it begs the question whether or not the party is what we might call crisis seeking. To the extent to which they are sort of obsessed with stability and development and security. Sort of the hidden line is the extent to which they actually work best when they're faced with a crisis, especially an existential crisis. So that's another thing that people misunderstand. I think
Professor,
yeah.
sorry, just when you were mentioning that, made me think of Napoleon saying that with China, let her sleep, right? Because if you wake her, then you realize she's a giant. Do you think that's something that the Western leaders today should get reminded of?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to be too, a historicist. I think in Napoleon's time, we were talking about a China that was certainly not capable of doing what it's capable of doing today. Um, the it's true that when the Europeans first came to China, really started coming to China in the Yuan and Ming dynasties, that they were terrified. They even classified, some of the Jesuits classified the Chinese as being Caucasian, as being white people, because the possibility that this society, which was so advanced, was neither Christian nor white, was terribly threatening to them in terms of their identity and their own sense of moral righteousness. And so, that's a whole fascinating sort of like, sort of, and then of course later, they're reclassified as an inferior yellow race, and then you have all the posturing that comes. And there's studies that have looked at the extent to which Europe accelerates its development in part due to fear of China. It's actually the case that Europe developed in part in reaction to um, the failures associated with the Dark Ages and the encroachments of the Islamic world, which then prompt this radical change in direction. So Europe has I think from the East has been propelling itself in a development model out of fear for a long time, and I don't think this fear has disappeared. Um, but to pick up on that point, but take it in a little bit different direction, one of the things that you see with Trump is sort of a retrograde. Um, one could argue that he's going back substantially to the 1980s um, ideological phrasings. He doesn't position the United States as a morally superior um, um, enterprise the way Reagan and the Republicans did at that time. Um, but nevertheless, this idea that the United States was able to discipline itself and defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, that we can do that again, that we have that capacity systemically. And the problem with this is twofold. The first is China today is vastly more powerful than what the Soviet Union was in the 1980s. And in relative terms, the US today is vastly less powerful relative to China than it was to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Furthermore, I would suggest that the way in which the deep patterns that were established with how the United States dealt with the economic challenges in the 1970s and 1980s is what set the table for the problems with debt and systemic failures that we see accelerating today. So, in a sense, you might say that the U.S. Leveraged or financed victory over the Soviet Union by uh, um, exploiting its own future. And and in this sense, I would suggest that maybe China was the only country that won the Cold War. It was China that pulls out of the Cold War and started doing this in 1968 when Mao started reaching out to the United States. And we forget that it was in the middle of the so-called Cultural Revolution that China brought Kissinger and Nixon to China, where China then starts moving down a very different path. Mao sets the table for Deng to advance reform and opening up. And so China, precisely at this moment when these other countries are moving down paths that will lead ultimately to failure, China's taking a different path, a different strategic vision. And this isn't this isn't by luck. This is looking very strategically at where things are going. And Mao himself, understanding in 1956, he says the Soviet Union will collapse, and he gives a very specific diagnosis for why it will collapse, and he's largely correct. He basically says the Soviet Union will stagnate. They're no longer able to really make progress, and as a result, they will fall behind. And so we need to be looking in different directions and moving in different ways. Um, and eventually, we're going to have to stand toe to toe with the United States. And so, what you do is, following this old yin yang thought and Sun Tzu, the art of war, you find out who your enemy is, and you get as close to them as possible, so that they try to hit you, they risk hitting themselves. In the meantime, you affect tech and financial transfers so that you can accelerate your own development and forestall conflict. So these are things these are sort of misunderstandings, I think, that sort of prevent people. Um, at the same time, you do have, like I was trained in part by a man that I deeply respect, Bruce Dixon. I did my PhD at George Washington University. We had three big China experts there at that time: Bruce Dixon, Harry Harding and David Shambaugh. Bruce is the one that I was really guided by. But Bruce, he trained at Michigan, and he was firmly convinced that the Chinese system was going to collapse, that the Western system was the end of history. And I remember after I'd come to China in 2010, he actually came and presented a closed door um, um, uh, topic to some of the senior party scholars, and he said at the end of his speech, he goes, "I still believe you guys are going to collapse. I don't know why you're not collapsing, but I'm going to keep studying to figure out how and when." And I just remember thinking at that time, that's a pretty hard thing to carry as an ideology in your research. And we've had sort of these collapse thesis versus threat thesis that have dominated sort of the two different aspects of American policymaking. Largely, the collapse thesis coming from the CIA funded scholars, and the threat thesis coming from the DoD funded scholars, which have really, I think, unfortunately, framed a lot of the discussion. You also had the problem for a long time. A lot of the Chinese language instructors, people who were teaching things about China, had come from Taiwan, and they were really promoting an anti-mainland message within the context of the Cold War. So it hasn't taken much to go back to this idea that China was the enemy. China is, not just the ideological side of it, but even the dog whistle tactics that you see associated with the current administration, which sort of always are flirting with race and racial differences. So I think all these things feed to a misunderstanding. Um, and honestly, I also think there's just, I sometimes question how many people in the U.S. are sober, uh, given the proliferation of opioids, prescription drugs, cannabis, alcohol. And the problems associated with hyperreality in a world driven by digitalization, and which is itself is being exploited by um, these huge corporate interests that are interested in promoting a certain worldview that you know this is the main problem. I was speaking. This is before the current prime minister of Japan was elected. I was working with some local Japanese diplomats, and they've gone silent since since she was elected. But they were really struggling with the problem that Japan's best interests are not found in um, in drawing close to the United States at expense with relations with China, but by finding a better balance and indeed moving forward with a trilateral trade agreement with Korea and China. But they said that the main problem is that um, we have our media is controlled by forces that are hostile to China, and they're constantly promoting um, um, their sort of economic interests and ideological interests, and this in a way poisons public opinion in Japan, and so even so it's not just a problem in the United States or in the West. There's this right next door in a society that owes so much culture, so much of its own culture to China. And I go to the French concession here in Shanghai, regularly go for a walk, go out for have a cup of coffee, and I always encounter Japanese tourists. They're coming here. They enjoy coming here. It's a short flight, couple hours, um, and um, and yet there's still this tremendous misunderstanding, willful misunderstanding, and part of it is due to the way that corporate media in various countries are for whatever reason invested in certain narratives that are antagonistic to the mainland.
Um, Professor, listening to you, it begs the question in my mind if really this kind of, I guess, the way the simplified debate gets framed is always like, oh, a capitalist system that's like, freedom of the individual versus communism, with all the attributes that people give to it, mostly negative, right, over here. But is capitalism versus communism, is that even the right comparison anymore? What do you think?
Well, to go back, remember capitalism in the West, it's capitalism or communism, and in China, it's capitalism and socialism. So it's again and versus or. You know, I have a 21-year-old daughter. I have a 17-year-old son. They can walk anywhere they want in Shanghai at any hour. They're mixed race, but they look Western, and they're not going to have any security problems. Um, they they are I would suggest that they are more empowered and free in many respects than people their own age in the United States. They have incredible access to technology, to online resources. Um, they don't face the sort of restrictions that 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 you might anticipate, but they do have certain social responsibilities. Um, so we can talk, for example, about um, gender or sexuality as a sort of a case study. So one of the concerns about in the West, of course, is the idea that you have uh, pride parades, you have a whole culture around the LGBT community, which is based fundamentally not simply in identity but in political struggle and in a contest with people who take a more heteronormative approach in discriminatory ways. In China, the understanding is okay, and you go back to the early 1990s when China abandoned the old Soviet classification of homosexuality as a mental illness, accepted it as part of human nature, and then moderated its policies since then. Um, the understanding, though, is that there are still a large number of people in China who are offended by homosexuality. In part, these are people who are offended by it, uh, not because of traditional cultural values, because traditionally there were no major concerns against homosexuality, as long as you fulfilled your responsibility to produce an heir, um, or you went into a monastery or um, a nunnery, you were fine. You could have homosexual relations as long as you were fulfilling your social responsibilities. But because of all these years of the Soviet position on homosexuality, which by the way continues to haunt Russia today, um, there are quite a large number of people who are antagonistic towards homosexuality. And so China's position is, all right, being homosexual is part of human nature. People have the right to be homosexual, but we're not going to allow people to go out and emulate Western activist um, um, uh, homosexual struggles, because that will create a conflict that will not only destabilize society, it will ultimately not benefit gay people either. Right? They will end up being diminished. So how do we mediate? How do we resolve this contradiction through time in a way that slowly moves towards a more just and equitable society? And I think this is what we're seeing, and I think it's a generational issue that within another 20 years, once some of the older generations have moved on, because what we see in the universities, um, and certainly what we see even among the working class who are in the universities, is a much more accepting position towards sexuality and gender. Um, so it's just a matter of time because they've gotten rid of the old ideological education that demonized that. So it just takes time to work through. So so this is an example of how things are progressing. Um, um, so as a result, my daughter's two best friends are gay men, and they're very openly gay. They're very obviously gay. They go everywhere together in the city. They never face any problems. Um, um, And they also happen to be, all three of them happen to be influencers. People know that they're gay. There's a guy, there's a transgender, male to female transgender, who's very clearly um, queering her identity, um, who sings traditional Chinese opera in women's clothing, and does a really, really good job of it. And traditionally in Peking opera, um, it was men who played the female roles. So you have a young transgender Chinese person who is dressing and living as a woman, who's performing this traditional art, and it's winning admirers from conservative Chinese who go, that's actually really good, and it's sort of reminding them of sort of like old cultural values. So we have sort of this change that's taking place, and so I'm just using this again as an example of um, you know how you're socially and politically managing this this social evolution in a way that's very different than what you see in the United States, which is through conflict. And I got to be me, and I'm going to go out on the front lines and fight to be me, even if that means that I'm going to be abused or beaten or face some sort of homophobic or lose my rights to join the military or lose my rights to transition, right? Or women fighting for um, losing their right to have an abortion. And this sort of interminable culture war or conflict that I think is part and parcel of sort of a systemic failure to achieve key breakthroughs and plateaus in social development and social progress. It's a very different way of actualizing human liberation and human development. Um, and hopefully this illustrates in part the point.
I think it's I mean, the thing that is not clear to me is how they managed to do it, right? But I don't know. I mean, I think you have explained it a good bit, and it's with the yin yang, with the and principle, the kind of the unification of opposites, unity of opposites, right? So being able to hold two competing ideas in your head simultaneously and just try to optimize for the best outcome in a way. That sounds fascinating to me. I'm an engineer, and I try to solve technical challenges or business challenges sometimes. And I guess to be practical, you often have to do that. You have to be okay with trade-offs and just make the best decision you can with the information you have. And what is yeah. And I don't even want to go into honestly evaluating how the West does it by comparison. But it's very clear
Well,
that
I
it
will
doesn't
say
do it like
this.
this.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is if we were to look at it from a technological perspective, and this is a little outside my range, but if you're looking at it more from an engineering perspective, um, we can understand that AI, for example, which interestingly enough has its most rapid adoption in ways that I think have far surpassed what you see in the U.S. In China, but AI is based on a linear way of thinking, which is an either/or way of thinking. But the next sort of paradigm shift, the next singularity in technologies is going to be quantum, right? And quantum computing is much more yin yang or dialectical in the way that it thinks. So it's going to be very interesting to see how China is sort of struggling and managing the AI revolution, and then what comes next with the quantum revolution. But there have been a number of theorists who have said that the quantum revolution is much closer to sort of a Marxist, a Hegelian Marxist way of understanding and constructing insights and conclusions.
Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
No, I just want to make a quick comment that, Lovis, we've spoken about this quite a bit, and I think you noticed it as well when you visited, right? That in the West, people are often talking about topics with the framework of judging whether something is right or wrong. But when you're in Asia and in China in particular, it's always about does it work or not? right? And so right and wrong versus does it work or not? And I guess when you say whether something works, it's a very practical judgment of, whether things are in harmony or stable, because if they're not, then it wouldn't work. And that could be about incentives, it could be about engineering problems, etc., right?
Right.
You see it with, let's say you look at the renewable energy take up in the West, it's often framed around this is the right thing to do, so do it. And whatever the results are, we have to do it because it's the right thing to do. Whereas when you look at how renewable energy is being deployed in China, it's more like, hey, this technology is very useful. How do we make it work? How do we integrate it into what we have currently? And moving forward, how do we prevent it causing, big gaps in productivity and costs, right?
Well,
So
let me make two interventions there. The first is, um, I would say the difference. So there's sort of two, both the renewable energy, but also what works. The practical side. Um, what works is fundamentally important. But I would suggest, and this will reveal sort of the Marxist in me, that part of the problem in the West, and this isn't simply my observation, and leading scholars at leading institutions who are not Marxists who have reached the same conclusion, is that the system, the political system in the U.S. is not really democratic. It doesn't really represent, above all, the main interest of Main Street, but a narrowing group of economic elites, and there have even been major theorists who have said that the U.S. is not really a democracy; it's an oligarchy, and it's become an even more robust oligarchy in the last 20 years. So, and by the way, this oligarchy continues to enrich itself. It continues. I mean, what works for them is still really working. You understand? So if we say the rubric of what works, the question is works for whom? All right. So in that case, I would say that the U.S. system still continues to feed the 1% or however you conceptualize them, but at the expense of others. And in China, that has not been the case. It's true that we have elites. It's true that we have corruption. It's true that people take care of themselves. But it's also true that we've raised 800 million people out of poverty, eliminated extreme poverty, and we have, um, um, excuse me just a minute. Leela, could you close your door? You just walked through a live shot. I sent you a message. Sorry. So we still have Chinese New Year holiday. um, but the
You were saying when you consider what works, it's important to consider what works for whom, etc.
right. So I would in my analysis, I would say that in the midterms, the Clinton's first midterms, when he moved the Democratic Party to the right, this is where we really begin to. I'm not blaming everything on Clinton, but this is where we really began to see both parties moving very much in the same direction, representing the same core interest. And although this has, moved in slightly different directions, I think that that's what it's the collusion of the two parties with financial deregulation that leads to 2008, for example. So a lot. So the U.S. has both has had sort of this oligarchic problem for a long time, and we haven't had that issue here because the way the party is singular and the way the party ultimately has to take responsibility in order to preserve its position of power. Um, and it has to do that at every level of government. Um, means that it can't play the game. So you can't have, the oligarchs who are funding this party or that party and playing a game of political distraction and diversion in order to perpetuate certain systems of inequity that keep them in a privileged position and keep other people being bled to death. The Chinese system just doesn't work that way. So, and you could say, well, in the West, we have this ideology that the government is always the problem, and we have to have a system that privileges private property rights, although most people don't really understand that private property rights means the right to own the means of production, which, of course, most people don't actually own, or a very select number of people do. But people conflate personal property rights with private property rights. So there are these differences, but the second intervention speaks directly to climate change. And this is another major misunderstanding that I think is taking place. And it's a misunderstanding with sort of different threads. The first thread is that climate change is a real problem, contrary to what the White House says, which basically describes it as a communist plot to dispossess the United States. Climate change is a real problem, and by many estimates, the country that's most vulnerable in the world to climate change in terms of exposed populations and fixed capital investments is China. 3 of the top 5 most vulnerable areas in the world are in China. This would be Shandong, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Guangdong. And China has a double problem. It's not just these hyper-developed, densely populated coastal regions that are facing extreme weather coming from the ocean. It's also being hollowed out by desertification. So, last week we had another sandstorm in Beijing. So coming all the way, and cities across the Northwest have already been lost. There are major efforts to bring water. They've already, if you look at water surveys, you'll see a lot of those cities are now black in terms of actual local water resources. China's still losing arable land. Food security is looking forward. Food security is a major issue. Every year, the first policy papers on agriculture, and that's related to food security. I suspect, I'm not saying this as a representative of the Chinese government, but I suspect that one of the reasons why the Chinese government let the one-child policy run as long as they did is because of food security concerns. And we know that food security plays a big role in geopolitics right now in terms of China sort of diversifying its where it gets food, increasingly from Brazil, bringing Brazil into BRICS versus the U.S., which has this leverage. China is part of what we call the global South. The global South as a whole is much more vulnerable to climate change. The global North, which includes the United States, is also vulnerable, but the global North, most especially the United States, really struggling against climate change is too costly. It's too costly for a couple of reasons. One, because, and this isn't simply my analysis, but the U.S. economy is largely a house of cards built on dollar dominance. And the dollar itself depends on a close relationship with oil. This is why even under Biden, Biden, who's supposed to be friendly to the environment, Biden, who shuts down the pipeline with Canada, and the economists all cheer, but then he opens the lands in Alaska, something that no Republican before him would have dared to do. And then the U.S. becomes the world's leading producer of petroleum. And in the meantime, we don't see any real meaningful development of EVs. The Ford recently shut down their F-150 EV plant. They're facing tremendous pressure from the White House. And so I think that what the U.S. has done is that they realized that the high cost of climate change is going to hit the U.S., but it's going to be much higher for the global South. The global South, these emerging markets, which are threatening U.S. hegemony, and for the U.S. to really commit to fighting against climate change, they would also have to dispossess themselves of the very things that have kept them in power. For example, dollar hegemony and the relationship with oil. So if you go back and you read the National Security Strategy, the new NSS, you see, the very specific language about being reinvigorating oil and coal, and the U.S. being the dominant energy country in the world. I would suggest that even under Biden, despite all the rhetoric, you have the U.S., which is increasingly weaponizing climate change. And in fact, I was in Ukraine a couple of years ago doing research on um, how the Ukraine conflict was largely related through pipelines and other things. It's about control of energy markets and how energy is paid for. This is one of the key factors driving that conflict. There are others, but it was um, and how Russia and the United States were complicit adversaries. That they were both global North countries that depended on oil-based economies. And so if you live in China and you travel around China and you see the major development, can you still hear me? So we were talking about climate change, and what I was saying is that if you understand most of the major development projects, so clearly China is very keen to advance AI, chip development, but green tech and green development, sustainable development. There has been not just the revolution that you perceive in terms of solar, wind, um, um, production, EVs, but the way in which several years ago they made every local area has a marshal who's responsible for the environment, and it's a lifetime accountability. If there are any um, spills or contaminations that take place due to corruption or negligence or something, then and so this is one of the reasons why when I moved to Shanghai in 2010, it was polluted. By 2013, it was really bad. And I had left Beijing, which was worse. But now, most days in Shanghai, we have air quality comparable to what you would find in Europe. Beijing. What's interesting about Beijing is that it's now the capital of trees. It has more trees than any other capital city in the world. When I first moved here, Suzhou Creek, which you can see outside my children's bedroom window, was basically an open sewer. Now, in just the 15, 16 years that I've been here, we've had the return of fish, waterfowl. You can see the birds coming in and diving on the river. Um, so massive efforts to clean up the environment, to protect the environment, because there is this clear understanding that climate change is an existential threat. One of the things that we see is that somewhere around 20% of China's food is grown in in terraced regions in Sichuan, Hunan, Yunnan, and what scientists have discovered is that these terraces are 2, 3,000 years old. That people have been farming there for millennia. And what they've also discovered is that they're highly resistant to climate change. Not just these regions, but this incredibly efficient use of water. The problem is they're labor intensive, um, and you can't bring tech in. You can't bring heavy machinery in to work the terraces the way you would in long flat fields. So now we've got scientific teams down in these regions trying to figure out um, what are the sort of the what's the traditional wisdom that needs to be figured out scientifically, but how can we leverage tech into these areas because we have aging populations, we have young people that no longer want to work that type of labor, but increasingly China will depend on being able to source its food from these regions because we're still losing arable land and other parts of the country. So, and if you look at the major irrigation projects going out towards the west, if you look at the incredible effort that we're concentrating on Chongming Island here in Shanghai, which is a linchpin of local ecology, if you look at the green belts, if you look at the way they brought trees back to the barren Xishan Mountains to create a green barrier for Beijing, most of the huge development projects are in some way related. I can give you another example. I was in Hefei, Anhui, which is one of the new Silicon Valleys of China. And if I was a foreign investor, I would really look at Hefei, although you're going to face really steep competition from really capable Chinese firms there, because the best ones are there. But Hefei, Anhui was traditionally a poor province. But Hefei has a couple of advantages right now. Um, One of the best, and some would argue the best, science and technology universities in Hefei, um, and they're producing a lot of high level graduates who then the government is supporting with incubator programs. But at the same time, Hefei is adjacent to a massive lake, and several years ago, Beijing put a mayor in Hefei who is an environmental scientist. They have been dredging the metals and the pollutants out of the lake, pressing them into bricks, trucking them up into the Anhui old coal mines that have been depleted, putting those old heavy metal pollution bricks down in the coal mines, and returning the lake to health. And then around from the lake around the city, there are wetlands, traditional wetlands, and they're restoring the wetlands to create these carbon traps. So they're creating a protected green zone in um, uh, Hefei. They have one of the big fusion reactors where they're doing the Tomahawk fusion reactors in Hefei, where they made one of the big recent breakthroughs. Um, they have um, um, some of the most advanced EV firms and AI firms in Hefei. So they're literally creating a green zone, a protected green zone, high tech investment uh, um, development. Um, and again, this is how do we stay competitive and drive the nation forward in the face of tech challenges today, but also how can we create a sustainable future despite the wages of climate change. Um, this is what's really driving China. The existential threat to China is not U.S. tech um, blockades or threats over Taiwan. These are concerns, but they're precisely the sort of concerns that the Chinese government is really, really capable of dealing with. And by the way, I'd illustrate this in a different way. As someone who worked previously in public health as a public health officer, who trained in epidemiology, um, one of the things that people don't understand about COVID is the extent to which it was caused by climate change. In fact, you go back to 2014, 15, 16, you go back and you start looking at the scientific literature, you see there are these models where they are predicting a major coronavirus outbreak for 2020. And the models are being driven by an understanding that we had already had three coronavirus outbreaks: SARS-1, SARS-2, and MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and that they were correlated with climate change, and that coronaviruses were especially vulnerable to small changes in the environment and more capable of jumping the species barrier. So as a result, they were a greater risk to humans and sort of an index on the problem of climate change. And as a result, you had all these laboratories and companies all over the world working on the problem of coronavirus. It's one of the reasons why Moderna was so advanced in their vaccine development. It's one of the reasons why they were doing research in Wuhan and other places. And not just the government, U.S. government was working with the Chinese government in Wuhan, and they had other installations around the world doing the same thing. Um, the issue is, so in part, the little easy low-hanging fruit is that COVID was caused by climate change. In fact, in October of 2019, the CDC delivered to the Trump White House a coronavirus outbreak plan. And the only problem with Corona is that it arrived, ahead of schedule. It arrived 5 or 6 months early. But despite it hitting, and I'm not saying it leaked from the laboratory in Wuhan. I think there's, I have reason to believe that didn't happen. But nevertheless, despite China um, being the first to be aware of it and absorbing that hit, the way the Chinese system was able to respond to that challenge, no other country was able to respond. And it was instrumental not only in saving millions of lives in China and extending lives, it was also vital to saving the world economy. 2020 is the year that China got everything together and produced the products that the rest of the world needed that they couldn't produce for themselves. And of course, this also created the fear around the world, oh, we need to decouple or we need to, create more security, because we can't depend on China necessarily if we can't produce the things that we need ourselves to survive in times of crises. Um, but it was precisely, this ability to respond to a problem nationwide, that was part of the Chinese capacity for governance, part of the Chinese capacity to respond to crisis. It was a problem that was related to the broader ecological crisis, which China is also responding to in ways that no other country is or likewise responding to. And so you see, I think, a lot of negative press still in the West about China still the largest carbon emitter. China still has a lot of coal-fired power plants, but it's also the case that China is still producing most of the products for the people. Like something like 70% of the products being produced in the world being produced in China. They're not for Chinese people; they're for the world. So a disproportionate amount of the world's pollution is being produced in China for the rest of the world. But at the same time, China is far exceeding others in terms of dealing with the climate crisis and the need for green transformation. And this is in part due to the recognition of this threat by the central government, but also its capacity to respond to that problem, and to do so with a very different strategic vision than what you see in the U.S., which is fundamentally, I think, committed to the old brown economy, and in my estimation, has effectively weaponized climate change against the global South generally, but against China specifically.
Well, that's an interesting perspective that I haven't heard yet. So thank you very much for sharing that. So, Professor, one thing that I wanted to kind of follow up on a bit. So you've mentioned a couple of times. So, for example, with the I forget what you called it, the kind of the steward that's responsible for the environmental cleanup, and you said if there's any spills, etc., like environmental destruction related to corruption, etc., this person is kind of accountable and on the hook. But so maybe with that example, but also others, like what happens to a governing person in China when they screw up? Because because I think that this is one of the things that when I listen to you speak, sounds distinctly different in the West, and like a key frustration that I have with, say, for example, in Germany, is that incompetent politicians ultimately just get promoted somewhere else. They don't really ever, when's the last time a prominent politician ever was punished for doing something wrong? And a lot of them are very blatantly doing things wrong, right? And then somehow they end up, just going to the next bigger governing body, maybe maybe, I don't know, in Germany, maybe they go from the federal level to the EU or something like that, right? Rather than actually somebody being held accountable. So how does that work in China, like accountability in general?
Well, I think the first issue is that when China began to accelerate reform and opening up from the late 70s, early 80s, it was a society that literally had to start doing things that ran fundamentally contrary to the social and political norms that had been established during the Mao years. And so literally the things that people were doing would have been regarded as criminal or immoral. Um, and to give you another example, when Deng Xiaoping established what we call the special economic zones, there was Shenzhen, the city of Shenzhen, which was adjacent to Hong Kong on the mainland side, um, was established as a special economic zone. And previously, if you wanted to go to Shenzhen, you had to go through border control. So if you were on the mainland side and you wanted to enter Shenzhen, you were Chinese, you had to have a special ID. We had to show your passport. And this is because these areas were sort of walled off laboratories for experimenting with rapid liberalization, but at the same time understanding from the Chinese Marxist point of view that global capitalists are immoral people. Of course they are, and so we need to like have these zones, and there was also like this perception, not officially, but I think in terms of real practice, that Western there's still this idea that Westerners are hypersexual, and that they are exoticist and orientalist in their sexual fetishization, and this idea that where you had seen the acceleration of Western investment and development paradigms in Asia, you also saw a service industry that provided prostitutes and other forms of hedonistic practices to sort of welcome these people and to that was what you needed to attract that capital and that investment. And so if you went to Shenzhen back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were what we call RNI communities, whole apartment complexes where people kept mistresses or where prostitutes lived, and there was a whole local economy of nail salons and whatever that and flower shops that served these economies. So there was it was this idea that in order to rapidly embrace this Western model, you were already going to be doing something dirty, but to really encourage them to come here, you had to really, become immoral in a way. And so that was sort of normalized, but it was contained within these special economic zones. And then the idea was, okay, we'll learn what works, we'll establish new governance paradigms, and then we'll slowly start to, and again, this is the and logic. So we'll do this, we'll have this experimentation, and then we'll start finding ways to bring it into um, more safely into broader society. So the I'm sorry, restate your question.
So how did it help to keep government accountable, like compared to
Right.
the West, right?
So the problem is as we as China began to accelerate its development, there was already this not normalization, but this sort of idea that you had to dance with the devil, and it contributed to a culture of corruption, both both morally but also systemically. That then when you have the really uh, faster development under the Jiang Zemin years, it that corruption becomes even more manifest. But as long as you have these really astronomically high growth rates, you could. No one really cared. It was all right, whatever. It's the way the world works, and you move forward. Um, but they were supposed to start doing some important reforms and transitioning with Hu Jintao. And Deng Xiaoping had set it up so that so um, Jiang Zemin came. We describe him as belonging to the Shanghai faction. He represents the high growth, densely urban areas along the coastline, whereas Hu Jintao represented the Tuan Pai, the Young Communist League, which is primarily rural, um, interior, and so there was supposed to be this structural transformation where when Hu Jintao would take power, one of the first things you're supposed to do is lead a party rectification, push the old paradigm out. And by the way, Deng had adopted this from Mao. Mao had said that the party needs a revolution against itself every 10 years, sort of knock down those elements that become entrenched in the present, in sort of vested interests that are resistant to change. So every 10 years, you need to have a revolution of the party. And then Deng tried to institutionalize this with 10-year cycles of leadership. So you have, 2 5-year terms, and then you have a new generation that comes in and takes power. So he had visualized Hu Jintao as being the corrective to all of this sort of excess that was associated with the Zheng years, which they felt was sort of unavoidable. The problem is the Zheng people had become so powerfully entrenched in the economy, above all in the property market, that he was unable to push them aside. And so we ended up, through that 10 years of Hu Jintao in power, gridlocked. And it's one of the reasons why we ended up with the property crisis, because the Zhang group would prevent any sort of meaningful reforms that would allow for other mechanisms for investment, and so people kept investing in property because that's where you could see the returns, and because that's where the young people were most heavily invested. That's what they wanted to encourage. And of course, this was unhealthy because it creates a bubble in the property market. You end up taking finance away from other sectors. And so, when President Xi comes in, one of the first things he has to do is he has to run this party rectification campaign. And there were more than two factions at that time. You had the Xishan faction, you had the oil faction. They're variously aligned with different groups. But, he starts moving through that. So when we talk about dealing with this issue, we have to realize that corruption and accountability were issues that you had social progress, you had national development, but you also had a high cost of corruption. And then it becomes clear that you should have made economic restructuring reforms with Hu Jintao, but you didn't. You didn't do that because you were still able to sustain for a period of time high rates of growth, but you ended up not making those reforms when you should have. So then this provokes the crisis, that then the party crisis, which then mobilizes the party to allow Xi to run what is essentially, the anti-corruption campaign is really a bloodletting against the party itself. So how do you have to, the party itself has to realize, okay, we're facing this crisis. Now we have to radically transform ourselves, and you allow that to happen. Of course, not everyone embraces it and loves it and accepts it, but the bulk of the party does, and thus it's empowered to do that. And so, so then you have this massive anti-corruption campaign, which has also tracked with a morality campaign um, for different reasons, and we won't go too far down that line. But that is taking place at the same time. So there's an anecdotal story. I doubt that it's true. It's probably just the stuff's from urban legend that when Xi Jinping takes power, of course, the thing that he's most concerned about is dealing with the factional divisions that have gridlocked the party. He's interested in establishing his own rule because when he first came in, he was given a standing committee that was evenly divided between these two factions, and the idea would be that he would sort of glad hand and sort of mediate between them, but instead he needs to deal effectively with both of them so that China can take steps forward. But what he has to do is he has to deal with that, but where he's facing immediate public outcry is related to pollution. And what you have are the middle classes in Shanghai and Beijing who are being instigated in part by the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Consulate, who are publishing PM5 data, 2.5 data, particulate data, and about how bad the pollution is. And then you have these middle class and upper class families who are now more interested in quality of life versus quantity issues. And so then you have this intense pressure that's being brought in these key economic and political regions. And so the anecdote is, why is the environment the thing that's most that people care most about, right? Because for him, he's got more of a global view of all the much bigger issues. But this is what starts leading to these reforms that then are forcing local officials to take responsibility. Because previously local officials had incentives for pollution. The more industrial development, the more vehicles you had on the road, building a trash incinerator, all these things were something that local officials had incentives. And we just went through Chinese New Year, right? And you go back 15 years ago. The night of Chinese New Year, you don't sleep, and the reason you don't sleep is either because you're celebrating or because everyone else is celebrating. And even Shanghai, if you go out, you can't drive because of all the smoke due to the fireworks. There's the whole city would be enveloped in smoke. Now they're illegal. They're completely illegal. You don't hear a single firework. The country that created fireworks and that above all celebrates Chinese New Year with fireworks, we don't do them. They're illegal in the city now. And so you go to sleep when you want to sleep and sleep when and no problem. But and we got rid of fireworks for two reasons. One, because each year we'd have a lot of people that got killed, and indeed this year in some of the rural areas we did have people get killed from. But we had fires that would get started. But we also it was the environmental issue. So all of these sort of massive changes that have taken place um, in order to create this culture of accountability and responsibility to directly deal with local people's concerns. So even though that wasn't foremost, let's say, possibly in the president's mind when he took power, it's something that became increasingly apparent that he had to deal with because that's what people wanted. Um, Now, there are different mechanisms for ensuring that this type of um, feedback or so certainly the party monitors social media. They see what people are concerned about, but what we also have are formal government mechanisms for people to communicate directly with government. Um, 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 we have institutional structures like the CPPCC, where people from around the country are brought in and provide a consulting function at a very high level, not only at the national level but at the local level. We have these groups. Um, but what we also have increasingly is digital governance, which has removed sort of the corrupt human factor um, and created not only where people are dealing more and more with AI, uh, but also whenever they deal with government officials, you have AI systems that are supervising and monitoring. So, for example, we have a system now in China called 12345. You can pick up any phone anywhere in the country. You can dial this number, and you go into a call center. The call center is organized and managed by AI, but it's humans who answer. And you raise a complaint, and then this complaint, by law, has to be triaged. You have to decide um, what's the level. Is it sort of an emergent concern, or is it something that's less immediate? Um, and then you have to then AI will then mobilize the different government units that have some responsibility. So one of the problems we had in the past is that China is invented bureaucracy more than 1,000 years ago and is the most bureaucratic country in the world. So you would often have the problem of different bureaucracies, different bureaus that had responsibility, but then wouldn't function well or work together to deal with a problem that required, a comprehensive solution. So now what you have is this AI system that figures out who are the various government stakeholders, brings them together, but then also compels a resolution within a certain time frame. And at the same time, AI is producing reports. Okay, so how many calls are we getting related to this type of problem? How many calls in this district? Do we have a problem with district governance? Do we have a problem with a specific official? Do we have a problem um, do we need a new law, a new rule? So it's created this whole new system of people being able to call in and address concerns. I can give you sort of a silly example. I live a couple of blocks from, or a block from a major shopping mall. um, they had some entrepreneur had decided to start running helicopter rides off the roof of this mall. And the helicopter would take off and it would circle our neighborhood and then come back and land on the shopping mall. And it was loud, right? And that went on for about 3 days, and then suddenly it disappeared. And I heard through my building WeChat group that a lot of people had called 12345 to complain about this, and then the government came in and shut it down because they were violating the decibel levels in this urban environment. Um, so you have this sort of mechanism that is responding. Now, altogether, the central government calls this whole process people's democracy. In other words, you put people first, and you're constantly having to come back and prove your legitimacy by establishing that you've been a responsible steward of the national interest in ways that people can perceive. And in this case, I think they continue to score high marks in terms of the approval ratings that we see of the central government, at least.
That sounds incredible, Professor. I think, I mean, part of me is a little split, right? Because I'm a very libertarian-minded person. I do think genuinely that less state in our life is better than more. But that is, of course, there's of course also reasons for all this, right? So I guess I haven't lived in a country with a state apparatus that is extremely efficient and actually makes a positive difference in people's lives, right? So I can see the other side. One thing I wanted to ask you, kind of point blank, right? Because it's I have my own very limited, but on my own personal experience visiting China, and I went with Jason last summer. Where we took 2 weeks and we traveled around. We saw lots of different places, met with lots of Chinese people, very interesting, usually above average successful people. And I asked all of them about the social credit system that is so infamously touted as such a dystopian tool in the West, even though nobody can really describe what it is, I guess, exactly. But so, being in Shanghai, having met some people that are probably at least 10, 15 years younger than Jason and I, having a couple drinks, walking around the streets, which are very safe, as you had said earlier. And we crossed the street where there was a red street light, right? And I was like, oh, wait, aren't you worried to lose points so that, and the person looked at me, like, what are you talking about? So what's the deal with that? Is this something that is, it might be just a misunderstanding, right? It might exist, but maybe it's something that's being tried locally. It's not national. It's not a national system. Or is this, in fact, a Western fiction to just kind of demonize China? Or like, what's behind this from your perspective?
I would say that there are two or three things to consider. The first is, in actual practice, the social credit system is much less powerful and destructive than what we would call a credit score in the United States. So, credit score in the US really determines your access to capital, whether or not you can rent a unit, buy a car, a lot of different things. It can affect employment. A lot of people now do background checks. And one of the things they'll do is check your credit score and not give you a job. If you don't have a good credit score, then they won't trust you. They won't think you're a responsible person. In China, firstly, the social credit system is in part an effort to develop something like a credit score, but from a socialist perspective, right? So in China, it's in part it's a word game. So, for example, in China, we never say middle class. We always say middle income, right? Because to say middle class would be to normalize a class structure, which the socialist system ideologically doesn't want to embrace. We do want middle income. We do want a growing middle income population. We do want a growing high income population, but we don't want a middle class. And we also don't want class struggle anymore. We know that it exists, but we want to manage it. We don't want to encourage it in the old form. So one of the problems that China has is we don't have a system for personal bankruptcy. And we don't have a lot of other laws that I think people take for granted in the West. And there's a real apprehension in China about putting in place personal bankruptcy laws. We have a growing phenomenon of people who are facing personal debt crises. At the same time, we have the opposite, which is we have people who save too much money. So we have this these two different sides. So I think there is the understanding that we need to have some sort of system, but it has to appear socialistic and have socialistic values, at least in some fundamental way, that achieves some of what you see with a credit score, so that we can really have a more responsible um, um, development and empower people who are good savers and avoid um, additional problems with people who are irresponsible with their personal finance. Um, Now, it is the case that there are questions about whether or not you're also breaking other laws, whether or not you're violating other rules or laws. And this should be part of your record. The main problem with China historically is, so I'll give you sort of a couple of sort of interesting anecdotes. Um, Going back, 10, 15 years ago, um, occasionally you would see two guys fighting, fist fight. They would punch it out, and as long as no one else was getting hurt, as long as property wasn't being destroyed, as long as it wasn't taking place in a restaurant or something. If I saw a fist fight in the university cafeteria between two guys. It was off hours, and there were three policemen sitting there watching the fight, and they did nothing. The two guys punched it out. One of the guys ended up on the floor, um, not knocked out, but sitting on the ground, and the other guy walked off. And the other guy picked himself off, and the police just ignored it. Um, we used to have a real problem with the police not wanting to do their job. And we have so many different types of police forces. We have like the police that enforce local urban rules and regulations, people selling things illegal on the street. We've got traffic police. We've got like the PSB who handle other matters of violent crimes. And unless it fell within their direct purview, they would ignore it. So we used to have a real problem with people sort of avoiding, so there's this paradox where on the one hand, the Chinese system is obsessed with responsibility, but this also, people also try to avoid responsibility if they can, because if you take responsibility, you are held responsible. So you'll also find the system trying to like say, okay, I'm not responsible for this. And this is one of the reasons why we've had some of the institutional reforms under Xi to bring these stakeholders together to make them all collectively responsible. But the main problem that people had with government was the extent to which it sort of ignored or didn't want to take responsibility, because it was taking responsibility for so much, it didn't want to take responsibility for smaller issues. And you know, I think in China's case, so let's look at it from another perspective. In the U.S., if you get a job if you're a professor and you get a job at the university, and someone doesn't like you, and they run through your social media, and they see that you said something at some point that would trigger, let's say, the whoever chairs the state appropriations committee that is ultimately approves the budget for your state university, um, then the university will find a reason to fire you or not hire you in the first place, right? So it's, on the one hand, you have a very powerful credit score in the US, which has all sorts of problems. But then you have other systems, other mechanisms that are also creating effectively social credit scores that can either give you opportunities or withhold them from you. But it's not um, it's not under government control. It's local, private, um, um, and this runs into all sorts of problems. In China, the idea they recognize this problem, and they realize that is a responsibility of government. And so what I'm part of what I'm saying is that this is a system that was developed because they needed to move forward with certain reforms related to finance. On the other hand, they also recognized in the age of social media that we need to have some sort of mechanism for standardizing and normalizing um, controls, social controls related to the proliferation of data and information, and at the same time recognize that well, there are new forms of governance and regulation and enforcement that are needed. So you go back again 15 years ago, we had a problem with people drinking and driving. We don't have that problem anymore. Um, we, we might have a problem with delivery drivers taking uppers so that they can run long hours. I don't know, but but drink driving is no longer an issue. The penalties are really high. The enforcement's really good. The culture has fundamentally changed, and this was recognized as a necessity because we now have millions and millions of cars on the road, um, and so the problem associated with drink driving increased exponentially. And so as a result, we see this very effective response. So anyway, my point is that as society develops and you realize that you need to have new regulations, new enforcements, or as you encounter new problems like pandemics, you need to have certain capacities to respond to these challenges. And so I think the social credit score is something that is part of that general milieu of trying to create a mechanism that is dealing with the absence of some kind of credit score mechanism, but also the need to push ahead with other forms of social development. To be honest with you, I've never, I'm aware of the negative discourses that follow this in the West, but but I've never seen the negative here. Okay, now the flip side of this, as I would argue, is that the there is a large group of people, and I'm going to get in trouble. I'm not going to get in trouble really, but I would say something that I've said in the past that irritates some people. We have a group of people, which I will loosely describe as Chinese liberals, who are critical of the party and the state. And they have social and political capital because they're critical, right? Now, they also know that there's a line. There's a line that you don't cross. If you do cross that line, you'll get into trouble. But by being critical, you actually attract some public support, and the government will work to co-opt you, give you funding or finance or look the other way. Why? Well, because the state can't go to war with everyone who's critical of it. It's one party, it's one system. It has to be able to represent all people. And there's something about, okay, well, I represent you, I tolerate you. You see, it shows that I'm a tolerant government. And so there's a whole group of sort of Chinese liberals who are critical of the state, and they enjoy privileges because they're critical of the state, but at the same time, they know to stay within certain boundaries, and that's in their interest. It's in their fundamental self-interest. So I kind of find their criticism to be self-serving and disingenuous in a way, that they're sort of complicit adversaries with the state, to use the old term for Pierre Bourdieu. So the idea that you have the social credit system that's a totalitarian scheme that's really strictly limiting everyone is kind of far-fetched. At the same time, even though we do now have better enforcement and better accountability, it's still the case that most of the time the government would rather not distract itself with whatever petty issue you have, or your propensity to cross the street incorrectly. It is the case that we still have periodically, what we call strike hard campaigns. So for example, I get into a taxi or a DD, uh, and the driver will tell me to buckle. I'm sitting in the back. He'll say, "You need to buckle up," and I'll say, "No, I don't want to buckle up." You say, "No, no, please buckle up." and then I look ahead and see at the intersection ahead, there's 5 or 6 policemen at the intersection. And what they're doing are checks. So they're doing checks that day to see who's wearing a seatbelt. And if you're not wearing a seatbelt, you and the driver get in trouble. Okay. All right. So you, the driver, you're not telling me to put on the seatbelt because you're trying to control me like some sort of, oppressive person. You're doing it because you know that they've got a strike hard campaign. And so, and if we get popped at the intersection because I refuse to wear a seatbelt and you chose to drive without me wearing a seatbelt, then we're both going to face some sort of little consequence. All right. But that's once every 3 or 4 months, you know what I mean? Every 5 or 6 months, depending on, so we have like these little things. Now there are other efforts that are more robust. For example, one of the things that I think President Xi did a really good job dealing with was organized crime. We still had a considerable amount of organized crime uh, uh, in China when he took power, and I'm sure it still exists in some form. But it used to be relatively public. You had brothels and gambling dens all over the city. There were 7 brothels just surrounding the university, and that wasn't even the densest area. Um, they're all gone now, and I'm sure a lot of it's online and it's going underground. But we had a very vigorous campaign, local police out fighting organized crime, locking them up, and because they were a big source of official corruption, so all of that was sort of fleshed out, and they still keep a very firm suppression mechanism against organized crime. So there are some campaigns that remain robust, and there's some that remain robust in terms of like enforcing environmental regulations, prohibitions against official corruption. But things like did you cross the street or were you wearing your seatbelt? You can't enforce that 100% of the time. I will say this: I crossed the street illegally the other day in front of a robot police vehicle, which criticized me in Chinese. And I forced it to come to stop because I was jaywalking. It was an awkward place. There was construction, and I wasn't just being a blatant criminal. I was trying to get across the street, but I did step across. This is out in the suburbs, and they had one of these unmanned EV police vehicles, and it sort of scolded me in Chinese. Um, okay, sorry, but I went on my way. Um, that's that.
Okay, so you weren't locked out of your home because of it, or weren't able to use the subway anymore for 2 weeks, etc. But there was a robotic
No, but my
police
but my point
officer,
is,
which,
no, my point
yeah,
is that we all know that there are moments when okay they're going to be watching seatbelt or jaywalking, or
yeah,
whether or not you're riding an e-bike without a license. There are these moments where they're trying to enforce these measures, and well they should. Okay, um,
right.
but
Well, so I
yeah,
will say, as a German, that's not at all strange to me, right? Like that, uh, traffic checks in Germany can be done for no cause at any time, right? Like any police officer can pull you over. That's, I think, legally speaking, that's different in Texas, for example, where I live now. But that doesn't phase me as being particularly authoritarian, because that's how I grew up in Germany, which is supposed to be very, very different.
well the system can't bear the weight of being totalizing authoritarian all the time. And largely society works in the absence of the state. I mean, this is one of the things. So you mentioned earlier, I can't imagine living in a country that you're a libertarian. You can't imagine living in a country where the state plays such a dominant role. In fact, the state is largely absent from so much of your daily life. I mean, it might be there in other ways, but it's not an overwhelming presence the way that people sometimes imagine. Um, Most people move through their daily life with absolutely no interaction with the state apparatus or the political apparatus at all, and prefer it that way. And by the way, the government prefers it that way as well. You're doing your thing. As long as you're doing your thing and you're not causing problems for us or other people, then so be it.
Professor, we've been taking so much of your time, and you've answered, I think, all of our most pressing questions. So I would like to get us to a close.
I'd
Jason, do
like
you
to.
have
I'd like
any?
to.
Yeah.
there's a point. I don't know. Stephen Ratner, um, who was a member of the Obama administration, who's an investor in China, recently came to China, and he wrote an op-ed that in the New York Times that's been circulating in China under the title "I just returned from China. We are not winning," and the um, the the punch out is the U.S. should learn from Chinese state-directed capitalism. And it's interesting because I think if you read it very critically, one of the things you'll notice is that he basically says that he doesn't think that the American system of democracy can really actualize the type of state-directed capitalism that China has, but that's what the U.S. essentially has to do in order to compete with China. So I kind of read it somewhat critically, saying that neither democracy nor capitalism in the United States are working anymore, um, which I think from people who from the right, or excuse me, people from the left who are worried that Trump represents the harbinger of some sort of return of fascism, that you can also see elements from the center of the left that are speaking in almost a similar way. I would suggest that article, that op-ed warrants close reading. I think he gets a lot of things wrong, but it's also interesting that he was talking about being in China because he was looking for investment opportunities, um, and um, and so it's interesting to see that piece showing up in the New York Times. Clearly, there's a partisan aspect because what he's really targeting is the Trump administration, um, but but nevertheless, it does raise some interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I haven't read it, but I shall go and do so. And yeah, I mean,
We can
in
link in the
many,
show notes.
yeah. Jason, do you have a closing question, remark for Joseph?
No, I learned a lot today. I will listen to the whole episode again. Um, yeah, I think overall it's just so important. I think for as many people as possible to visit China if they can, and a lot of the misunderstandings will be clarified pretty quickly upon arrival, right? Like that you realize that this impression you've had of this country is just far removed from what it is in reality. So
Well, there are issues though. You guys said that you came to China, right? And if you come to Shanghai, you will land and experience one of the most developed and well-governed cities in the world, one of the largest cities in the world. And if you go to Beijing, something similar, right? And if you're in Beijing on a bad day where there's a sandstorm, you go, oh, this is something wrong. Or some days we have weather patterns that bring the pollution in from Jiangsu factories that sort of get trapped in the city, and then we have sort of a bad air day. But they're relatively rare now. But if you just happen to be here, but China is still a developing country. 400 million people are now middle income level. 800 million lifted out of poverty, but the vast majority of the 1.5 million people are still lower income. And you get out into some rural areas, and you'll see development levels that are certainly not comparable to what you would find in Shanghai. But at the same time, I think what you see happening in rural areas now in China much better than what you would see happening in Alabama or other places. The rural revitalization campaigns um, um, have borne, I think, tremendous fruit in the last several years, as well as the environmental cleanups. So there are different Chinas, and there are parts of China that are in the vanguard of human development, and there are those that are still lagging. Um, I would say that it took me. I think despite all of my preparation, despite the PhD, despite all this, I I didn't really figure out China until about 8 years ago. Like it took a long time of really raising my children in schools here, getting married here, getting divorced here, going to court here, um, working for the government, working as a consultant with private. It was only after living here a really long time and already having a relatively open mind and sort of having that I really begin to push past even the ideological terminologies that you have from the West or that the Chinese themselves give you as elements of discourse. So I don't want to be like one of those expats or foreigners who goes, oh, you got to live a really long place, but then you really understand things. What I'm saying to you is, I I, I lived here a really a long time to really understand, and what I came to understand is that this is an incredibly capable system that is really interested in social and human development, that realizes that this is a global concern, that realizes that there are limits to state power and the international projection of power. Um, and it is trying to resolve things in a positive way, domestically and internationally. It's not a zero sum. It's not a communist plot. It's not an effort to affect regime change in other countries. It's not aimed at overthrowing the United States. It would certainly like the United States to stop playing games unilaterally, militarily, and economically. But what the U.S. chooses to do with its own governance is ultimately its own business, as long as it's not impinging on others. So, but it took me a long time to understand how deeply embedded that was in Chinese ways of thinking and Chinese values. Um, and of course, you run into people who are very vitriolic, who have radical nationalist agendas, who say very provocative things, um, and um, and you can allow that. And I'm saying Chinese people themselves, um, and you have the weight of history. You say, okay, well, isn't this the same party that was responsible for certain problems in the past, and aren't they still that same party that's still sort of morally reprehensible or guilty of those sins? Um, how do you these are all difficult questions I think people struggle with, but I think the record of progress and above all, what we should take as the alternative. So if we understand that there's China and then the major alternative is the United States, I think the Chinese system is much more benign and constructive for human development, whereas I think the U.S. system is not only destroying itself but at risk for destroying the rest of the world. Above all, going back to the weaponization of climate change. But that's my final take. So thank you guys for inviting me. Sorry that we rambled a bit, but feel free to edit as you see fit.
Thank you,
Oh, thank you
Professor.
very much.
How can our listeners follow more of your work if they got interested in what we were discussing today?
The best place to see everything that I publish, or like I do a lot of media. I do about 200 TV shows a year. I won the national first prize in national journalism awards last year for a documentary on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 system. So everything that I do, all the media work, everything that I write, is posted in my LinkedIn account, which is under my full name, Josef Gregory Mahoney. So anyone who wants to tap into that, they can see. Uh, and and if anyone wants to connect with me, that I welcome the connection.
Great. And that documentary, is that available for people outside China to view, or?
I believe it is. It's it's on. It was produced by BRTV um, out of Beijing.
Okay. So yeah, we'll try and hunt that one down, Louis, and put it in the show notes. I want to watch it too. All right.
All right.
Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Y'all take
truly.
care.
And that wraps up our main conversation. But we're not done yet. We're going into overtime, where Jason and I unpack some insights, reflect on what just happened, and connect a few dots. And go. Jace, this is
Longest episode ever.
going down as the longest episode in history. Let's keep our recap short because it's 10 p.m. and I'm tired.
Yeah, man, you're soldiering on well.
So So, what's something that you think? I mean, what's something that surprised you from Professor Joseph Mahoney?
I think I loved what he said about the Chinese interpreting things with that yin and yang system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty cool because it crystallizes a lot of the ways we were describing things with many more words, right?
Yeah,
When he says in the West it's either or, but in their system it's more and. It's true, you know,
yeah,
and that runs through everything.
yeah.
There's nothing you can really think about that has something to do with China that does not have that lens or that foundation with which it was built, right?
We were just, I mean, so, so we were just talking about this right in our last conversation where we talked about Taipan and how the girl is like wants to throw, like she's like pretending like she's gonna throw the silver brick into the river, but she doesn't because it's like, what do you think? I'm crazy? You know, like it's like you do it, but you don't do it. Or we were talking about the financial system and like how Hong Kong with like absolutely no capital control coexists with like a pretty closed system, mainland China right next to it, because it's like it's always like you try to find the synthesis of both, right? Both competing ideas.
Yeah. So to me, that was a huge one.
Yeah, I thought that was
Um,
super cool too.
I enjoyed his description of Shenyang in Liaoning because I was there, like I said, during the episode, and you could tell it was super industrial. But you know, when he draws the picture of or paints the picture of people burning tires to stay warm,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you can really imagine, right? Like this place is even further north than Pyongyang, like North Korea. So you can just imagine how cold and hard it would be, and if you're in poverty, what that would feel like. So that was pretty cool. I like that he highlighted also that there are many different Chinas, and you know, now when China's starting to open up a little bit and allow more tourism, encouraging more tourism without needing visas, I guess most people will be going to the top tier cities, right? But if they can take the time to go to the more rural parts, I think they'll find it very rewarding as well. Just to see, you know, that hey, this is one country, and for me, the encouraging thing about China is that it feels like if you're from a rural part of the country, there's paths for you to take. You know, in the poor parts of the country, there are paths for you to take to actually, you know, pursue a different life if you want to. I'm not saying it's super easy, but those paths exist, and I don't always see that in other countries that I visit. Right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, so what I had said earlier in the conversation that I'm libertarian leaning, and I still think that less state is better. He kind of paraphrased me a little wrong there towards the end. He was like, "Oh, you said as if I had said I can't imagine living in a country that has the state so present in everybody's life." But that's not actually what I said. I said I can't imagine living in a country where the state is actually efficient, right? And actually looking out for the people.
Yeah.
Because I haven't had that experience. But ultimately, and this is a note that I took while he was talking, right? Because I'm like, you and I have talked about this a lot. What do I really care about, right? In terms of what I want from my government, and it's very little, right? I want to know that I'm safe, that my family is safe, that I can build towards prosperity and, like with longevity. So like for me and my family. So I don't mean that I need to insist on my own life enduring, but like being able to build something for my family. So that means property or prosperity, etc., education. And which system enables that, or it's not, or does the absence of a system really enable that better? Is really something that I can't really fully resolve for myself, right? Um, So ultimately, I don't care, right? Like as long as I can have these, I would call them freedoms. I don't really care if I live in a democracy or if I live in a ANCAP natural order, whatever, or if I live in what other people call communist country or socialist country. Like I really don't care about the label. I care that it works and for me and my family and people at large, right?
I think what you're describing, if I could, let me try and paraphrase you, Lovis.
Please.
Is you want to live in a system where it allows you to practice low time preference, right? It
Right.
allows you to to plant seeds, plant trees, knowing that your grandkids will be able to sit in its shade, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't really care so much. Is it a king? Is it a prime minister? Right? As long as it works, you just don't want,
Yeah,
right?
as long as they don't come and mess with me, right?
Yeah.
Like
And
I'm not.
messing with you it can come down to, oh, they're educating your kids in unnatural ways, or they need to send your kids off to war, or they take 70% of your discretionary income. Who cares if a king is doing that or somebody that's won the Nobel Peace Prize and is super democratic, right? At the end of the day.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so whoever is exerting like violence, right, against me, I'm not gonna be a fan of. And like you said, doesn't matter if that's a king or a dictator or a democratically elected person, they're still exerting violence, right?
Exactly.
So,
If he puts you in a gulag and because he he had a democratic mandate, it doesn't make your time in that gulag less
yeah.
painful, right? Yeah.
And so as a principle, as like, oh, the end of history, etc. Like that never made any sense to me.
But I think the or thing, right? The or thing, it on one hand it explains a lot about how China works, but on the other hand, it explains a lot about how the West seems to be tripping over itself at the moment, right?
Yeah.
Like it can't build because it's still busy arguing about what's right and what's wrong.
Well, and it's like, oh, like Germany is trying to be super green, but then fatally neglecting the actual infrastructure build out that needs to go along with installing solar and wind and whatnot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because like, oh, well, that's the old system that we're retiring, and it's like, well, but the new one won't work without it either, right? So it just like, and the problem though too ideologically, or also the way the state communicates with the people, right? It then automatically makes it so that everybody's a hypocrite, right? Because you can only be for green or against it, right?
Yeah.
But like, oh, we're for green, but yet we're burning more coal than we have in 30 years. So you guys suck. It's like, well, but that's not fair because we are making advances, right?
Yeah.
But
We're trying to do the right thing.
Right, but no, I know, but it's the thing is that no matter how you turn, you're a hypocrite because you have to be so binary about it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and because we lost that ability, or we don't appreciate the ability of this unity of opposites, of being able to hold two or more competing ideas in your head at the same time and let them kind of coexist in a way.
Yeah.
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 So,
And dude, the number of times I've been in Germany and had long hours, long conversations, only to come to the point where the closing two statements are that won't work, and the other person saying, yeah, but it's the right thing to do, right? And with that as an overarching philosophy,
well, then you get exactly what you see now is
yeah. Like,
if it's the right thing to do, it becomes immaterial because it doesn't work.
yeah, is sail the ship onto the rocks, right? Because that's the right thing to do, and come what may, right?
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating. I mean, I'm not a history buff, and certainly not of Eastern Chinese history, but professor definitely gave us the freaking lowdown on the historical origin of a lot of the way, how the thinking and the worldview originated. Which I wonder if you can dissect that with your friend Albert sometime. I don't think it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I need to listen to the episode again. Yeah, and dig into a few of the things he said a little deeper. Maybe we should have a part 2 over time after we've studied the stuff a little bit more, because I think so much of it was new material for us, right?
Yeah, super new.
And it's pretty cool that
he tried his best to give succinct answers, but his knowledge is so deep, he just can't give you half an answer, you know?
Yeah.
Which
exactly.
I appreciate.
Yeah.
I appreciate. I felt like I made him feel like I was like displeased with his answers or anything. I was not at all. I thought it was amazing. I was just like, it's late and my brain is not has high capacity. So.
Yeah. But super interesting, Elvis. Thank you so much.